All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, well, you want to know more about how Ethiopian courts handle, rulings from foreign countries. And to be honest, after digging through all this material, it's way more interesting than I thought it'd be. We've got actual court documents straight from the Ethiopian Federal Supreme Court, plus some expert analysis to help us make sense of it all. The case that kind of kicked off this whole deep dive, it involves this woman who's trying to enforce a U.S. divorce decree in Ethiopia, including how they divided up their property. Seems pretty simple, right? But, and here's where things get kind of tricky, the first court in Ethiopia actually rejected her request. They said there wasn't any specific agreement between the U.S. and Ethiopia about, enforcing each other's court decisions. It was basically like they were saying, no treaty, no deal.
No, but hold on, there's a twist. A higher court steps in and overturns that decision, saying the lower court made a, get this, a fundamental legal error.
So to break down this whole legal drama and really get into how foreign judgments actually work in Ethiopia, let's bring in our expert. What are your thoughts on this case?
Well, what's really interesting here is that this case shows us how much deeper Ethiopian law goes than just looking for a simple treaty. Their civil procedure code, it actually lays out two main ways a foreign judgment can be enforced.
Okay, so there's more to it than just a yes or no on a treaty.
Yeah, exactly. The first way, like you mentioned, is through a bilateral agreement. It's like almost like a contract between two countries saying, hey, we agree to respect each other's court rulings. But the second way is honestly even more interesting because it comes into play even if there isn't a treaty.
All right, now I'm really curious. So tell me, what's this second way all about?
It all boils down to this thing called Article 458 of their code. Think of it kind of like a checklist that Ethiopian courts use to see if a foreign judgment, holds up. And one of the most important things on that list is this idea of reciprocity.
Reciprocity. Rings a bell, but I don't know. I can't quite remember.
Well, it's basically you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Ethiopian courts are basically asking, would the courts in this other country, in this case, the U.S., would they enforce a judgment from us? And if the answer is no, well, that throws a big wrench in the whole thing.
So it's like a fairness check then. Like Ethiopia is saying, we're happy to play ball, but only if you play by the same rules. I like it.
Yeah, you got it. And it doesn't stop there. Article 458 has a whole bunch of other conditions, too. Like the foreign judgment, it has to come from a real court, obviously. It has to follow the right procedures, be a final decision. And it can't go against, what Ethiopia considers public order or morality. It's pretty thorough.
Wow, so there's way more to this than I thought. Okay, so back to our case. How did all of this play out with the U.S. divorce decree?
Right. Well, remember how the lower court just dismissed the woman's request because they didn't find a treaty between the U.S. and Ethiopia? They basically zeroed in on that one thing and totally missed the bigger picture.
Yeah, that seemed like a pretty big miss, especially with all those other conditions in Article 458 that they should have looked at. So did the higher court catch that?
Oh, absolutely. They called out that fundamental legal error loud and clear. They basically said that all the relevant factors have to be considered, not just whether or not there's a treaty. It was like, back to the drawing board.
So it wasn't a complete dead end for her, more like, like a detour. This must have been a big wake-up call for other courts in Ethiopia, don't you think?
Definitely. It set a precedent, Clarified that courts in Ethiopia can't just dismiss a case because there's no treaty. They got to dig deeper, think about that reciprocity thing, and check all the boxes in Article 458.
This whole idea of reciprocity is really interesting. But how do they actually figure out if another country would uphold a similar judgment? What kind of proof are they looking for?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Ethiopian law is pretty open-minded about what kind of evidence they'll consider.
Wait, really? What do you mean by open-minded?
I mean, they're not just limited to official documents or super strict rules. Think about it. If you had to convince a court in another country that the U.S. legal system works a certain way, how would you do it?
Well, I guess you could bring in legal experts from the U.S., show them other cases that were upheld, maybe even point to precedents, to show how things are usually done.
Exactly. And Ethiopian courts are totally open to that. They'll consider expert opinions, case studies, historical stuff, even testimony from people who know how the U.S. legal system works. It's actually a pretty flexible approach, which I find fascinating.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like they're going above and beyond to make sure things are fair and they really understand the situation. So it's not just black and white, treaty or no treaty. It's about looking at all these different factors.
Yeah, you got it. This case really shows how Ethiopia's approach to foreign judgments is much more complex than most people realize.
This is all so insightful. I bet our listener is already thinking about what this means for other types of judgments, not just divorce decrees. But before we jump into that, let's take a quick break and we'll come back to explore those nuances.
It's like this case opens up this whole other conversation about how legal systems, around the world, how they kind of work together.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like each country's got its own laws, its own ways of doing things, even cultural things that affect their legal system. It's almost like trying to fit puzzle pieces from totally different puzzles together.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, sometimes the pieces fit, sometimes you got to get creative. So how do you bridge that gap between, these totally different legal systems?
That's where this whole fascinating area of law comes in. It's called private international law.
Okay.
It's basically the bridge between different countries' laws. It gives us a way to, deal with conflicts and figure out which laws actually apply when you've got a situation that crosses borders.
So like in this case with U.S. divorce, it's not just about Ethiopian law. It's about understanding how things work in the U.S. legal system and how an Ethiopian court might see that, right?
Exactly. And that's where this idea of comity comes in.
Comedy, that's another one of those fancy legal terms.
Yeah, it is. But it's basically like the spirit of cooperation between different legal systems, a way of showing mutual respect.
It's like the legal version of playing nice on a global scale.
Haha. Yeah, there's definitely an element of that. The idea is that countries should, generally recognize and uphold each other's legal decisions, even when there's no, official treaty saying they have to.
Mhm.
It's all about trust and making sure things are predictable, in international legal stuff.
So even though there's no formal agreement between the U.S. and Ethiopia about enforcing judgments, there's still this, underlying principle of comedy that encourages them to work together.
Exactly. And honestly, it's often in a country's best interest to uphold foreign judgments, especially if they want their own judgments to be taken seriously in other countries. It's like building a global reputation for being reliable, someone you can trust in legal matters.
Yeah, that makes sense. You want other countries to respect your laws, you got to show them the same respect.
Right. And this case is a perfect example of how all these principles actually play out in the real world. The Ethiopian court, by focusing on reciprocity and really digging into the details, they're basically saying, look, we're happy to play by the rules of international law, and we expect other countries to do the same.
It's like they're setting the standard for how they want to be treated by other legal systems. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about divorce decrees, but what about other types of judgments? What about financial rulings or child custody decisions? How do these principles apply there?
Oh, that's a great question. The specific things they consider, those might change depending on what kind of judgment it is. Like, if it's a child custody case, the court's main focus is going to be, what's best for the child.
Right, of course.
They'd have to figure out which country is in a better position to protect the child's interests, right?
Yeah.
That could mean looking at where the child lives, which legal system knows more about the case, which country can provide a more stable environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when it comes to money stuff, like financial judgments, courts might look at where the assets are, where the debt happened, which legal system has the best ways to enforce the ruling.
It sounds like enforcing these judgments from other countries is a real balancing act.
Hmm.
Courts have to weigh all these legal ideas, practical stuff, and the unique circumstances of each case.
You got it. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. Every case is different, it's got its own challenges, and it needs to be carefully thought through.
This whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to how complicated it is to enforce foreign judgments. It's way more nuanced than I ever thought. I'm sure our listeners feeling the same way. But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about public order and morality. How do those ideas play into enforcing a judgment from another country?
Oh, that's a really important point. Remember how Article 458 of the Ethiopian Code says a foreign judgment can't be enforced if it goes against Ethiopian public order or their ideas about morality?
Right, right.
So even if a judgment ticks all the other boxes, it can still be tossed out if it clashes with fundamental Ethiopian values.
So even if everything else checks out, if it goes against what Ethiopia considers important, it's a no-go.
Exactly. Every country has its own core principles that it's not willing to compromise on.
Can you give us some examples, like what kinds of judgments might be seen as going against Ethiopian public order or morality?
Well, imagine a judgment that, violates basic human rights or promotes discrimination. that would probably be seen as incompatible with Ethiopian public order, right? Or something that goes against deeply held cultural or religious beliefs.
Yeah, I can see how those kinds of judgments would be a problem for Ethiopian courts.
Exactly. It's how countries protect their own values, Make sure that foreign judgments don't mess with their social fabric.
This raises another question then. What happens when there's a conflict between different legal systems?
Yeah.
How do courts handle those situations where the values clash?
Oh, that's a great question and a tough one. Courts all over the world are dealing with this all the time. Sometimes they'll try to find compromise, a way to partially enforce a judgment, while still upholding their own sense of public order.
So it's not always all or nothing. There might be some wiggle room to find common ground.
Right. It often takes a creative approach and a nuanced understanding of the situation to balance different legal perspectives and find a solution that works for everyone.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've talked about the Ethiopian Civil Procedure Code, reciprocity, comity, public order. We've even touched on the bigger picture of how legal systems work together globally. I think our listener has a much better understanding now of how foreign judgments are enforced, not just in Ethiopia, but everywhere.
I agree. This has been a great conversation. Hopefully our listener is inspired to learn even more about this stuff.
Well, unfortunately, we're just about out of time for today's deep dive.
Yeah, it feels like we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to this whole thing.
It really is like a rabbit hole of legal stuff.
Before we go, though, I want to go back to that idea of reciprocity for a sec, because it got me thinking. If a country wants its own judgments, to be taken seriously by other countries, they got to be willing to do the same, right? Like uphold foreign judgments in their own courts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a two-way street for sure.
Yeah.
If you want other countries to recognize and enforce what your courts decide, you got to be willing to do the same for them. It's about building that trust, that mutual respect on a global legal level. It's almost like, I don't know, like diplomacy, but through the legal system. By showing they're willing to play by the rules of international law, and uphold those ideas of comity and reciprocity, countries can actually build stronger relationships with each other.
That's a really good point. It's like recognizing that we're all part of this bigger global legal system and that working together is key to making sure things are stable and predictable, legally speaking, for everyone.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've covered so much: the Ethiopian Civil Procedure Code, reciprocity, comity, public order. I mean, we've even touched on how legal systems cooperate globally. I feel like our listeners walking away with a much better grasp on how foreign judgments are enforced, not just in Ethiopia, but all over the world.
Definitely. It's been great exploring all this, and I hope it makes our listener want to learn even more.
Well, sadly, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, keep those minds engaged and never stop asking questions.